February 7, 1944. Somewhere over the Rhine Valley, Oberlieutenant Klaus Mietusch of Jagdgeschwader 26 checked his fuel gauge and allowed himself a thin smile. The American fighter formation 8,000 feet below was turning back, their contrails arcing westward toward England, right on schedule. For nearly 3 years, this had been the pattern, as predictable as the tides. Allied escort fighters would venture as far as their fuel allowed, perhaps to Aachen on a good day, maybe to Cologne if they pushed their luck, then inevitably turn for home, and then the killing would begin. Mietusch had 83 confirmed victories. He understood the mathematics of aerial warfare as well as any man alive. Range was destiny. An escort fighter was nothing more than a fuel tank with wings and guns, and when the fuel ran low, the escort turned back. The bombers would continue alone, deep into Germany, and there the Luftwaffe would be waiting. The Americans could build all the fighters they wanted, could train all the pilots their vast country could produce, but they could not change the fundamental equation. Physics did not negotiate. The briefing that morning at Florenz had been routine. Intelligence expected approximately 300 heavy bombers targeting Frankfurt's industrial facilities. American P-47 Thunderbolts would escort to approximately the German border. After that, the bombers would be naked, vulnerable, easy prey for the concentrated Gruppe assembled for the interception. The Luftwaffe had refined this defensive strategy into brutal efficiency. Let the escorts come and go, wait for the bombers. Strike hard, repeat. But something had changed in the winter of 1944. Something that would shatter every assumption German fighter pilots held about the limitations of American aviation. The signs had been subtle at first. Fragmentary reports from other Geschwader, isolated incidents that seemed like flukes or exaggerations. Then came March 4th. Then came Berlin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The crisis facing the Luftwaffe by early 1944 was not one of courage or skill. German fighter pilots remained among the most experienced and capable in the world. Many had been flying combat since the war's opening campaigns, had survived the Battle of Britain, the savage fighting over Russia, the grinding attrition of the Mediterranean theater. They flew excellent aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf FW-190A, machines that could hold their own against most Allied fighters in single combat. They employed tactical doctrines refined through years of combat, formations and attack patterns optimized for destroying heavy bombers. But the strategic situation was deteriorating. American bomber formations grew larger with each passing month. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was becoming a weapon of industrial destruction, capable of putting hundreds of heavy bombers over Germany daily. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator carried the war deep into the Reich, striking ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks. Each raid cost Germany resources it could ill afford to lose, killed skilled workers who could not be replaced, disrupted production schedules that grew more desperate by the week. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy relied entirely on one critical vulnerability in the American campaign. Escort fighters could not accompany the bombers to distant targets. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, introduced in spring of 1943, had extended escort range substantially compared to earlier types. With a 108-gallon paper drop tank, the Thunderbolt could reach approximately 375 miles from its English bases. This allowed protection to targets in western Germany, the Ruhr industrial region, and areas near the Dutch and Belgian borders. Beyond that invisible line in the sky, the bombers flew alone. And beyond that line, the Luftwaffe assembled its forces, waiting with the patience of experienced hunters. The mathematics were straightforward and unforgiving. The Thunderbolt carried approximately 370 gallons of internal fuel. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, particularly at combat power settings. Even with external tanks, the escort radius remained limited by the fundamental equation of fuel capacity divided by consumption rate multiplied by the aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency. German intelligence had studied American escort fighters meticulously. Technical reports documented their capabilities, their strengths, their limitations. The Thunderbolt was fast, heavily armed, and could absorb tremendous battle damage. But it could not fly to Berlin, not even close. The German capital lay nearly 600 miles from the American bases in East Anglia. A round-trip mission exceeded 1,100 miles. No single-engine fighter possessed that range. It was aeronautical fact, confirmed by physics and mathematics. Major Heinz Bahr, a decorated ace with over 200 victories across all fronts, expressed the prevailing wisdom in a February 1944 briefing to his group. The Americans are building a new fighter, this Mustang we have been hearing about. Intelligence says it has good performance, perhaps very good performance. But it cannot change the fundamental problem they face. A fighter must carry fuel, weapons, ammunition, armor, radio equipment. There are only so many pounds available for fuel before the aircraft becomes too heavy to fight effectively. The Americans face the same physics we do. They cannot overcome this limitation. This confidence was not mere propaganda or wishful thinking. It was grounded in solid engineering reality as German pilots understood it. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G carried approximately 88 gallons of internal fuel. Combat radius rarely exceeded 200 miles. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A, with slightly greater fuel capacity, achieved perhaps 250 miles under optimal conditions. German designers had explored extended-range fighter concepts, but the trade-offs proved unacceptable. More fuel meant more weight. More weight meant reduced performance, degraded handling, increased vulnerability. The Luftwaffe had accepted these limitations as fundamental constants of fighter design. Fighters fought near their bases. Long-range missions required twin-engine heavy fighters, aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Me 410, machines that possessed the fuel capacity for extended operations but lacked the agility and performance to survive against single-engine fighters. The idea that a high-performance single-engine fighter could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back seemed as fantastical as proposing a bomber that could fly to New York and return to Germany. But while German pilots operated under these comfortable assumptions, American engineers had been solving problems. The North American P-51 Mustang emerged from a unique set of circumstances in 1940. The British Purchasing Commission, desperate for fighters, approached North American Aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40s under license. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, countered with a bold proposal. "Give us 120 days and we will design you a better fighter from scratch." The resulting aircraft combined several innovative elements. The fuselage was designed around the RAF's requirements, using sophisticated lofting techniques that produced exceptionally clean aerodynamics. The wing employed a laminar-flow airfoil developed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a design that maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing chord, dramatically reducing drag. Internal fuel capacity was generous for fighter standards, approximately 184 gallons in fuselage tanks. But the early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, disappointed at high altitude where bomber escort combat occurred. The Allison's single-stage supercharger lost power above 15,000 feet, relegating the P-51A to low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The aircraft potential remained unrealized until someone proposed mating the Mustang airframe with Britain's most successful engine, The Rolls-Royce Merlin fitted with a sophisticated two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power to 30,000 feet and beyond. The transformation was dramatic. The Packard V1650-3, an American-built Merlin, turned the Mustang from a promising disappointment into potentially the war's finest fighter. Maximum speed exceeded 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling reached 41,000 feet. Handling remained crisp and responsive despite the increased weight. But most revolutionary was the range. The P-51B, with 184 gallons internal fuel and two 108-gallon paper drop tanks, could theoretically achieve escort radius exceeding 850 miles. Berlin was suddenly, impossibly within reach. But theoretical range and operational reality were different matters. No one had actually done it. The missions had to be planned, tested, and proven before anyone could claim the impossible had become possible. Colonel Donald Blakeslee commanded the 4th Fighter Group at Debden, one of the most experienced and successful fighter units in the 8th Air Force. Their pilots had flown Spitfires, then Thunderbolts, accumulating hundreds of combat missions escorting bombers into Germany. On February 20, 1944, they transitioned to Mustangs, receiving
factory-fresh P-51Bs with barely enough time to learn the aircraft systems before flying combat missions. Blakeslee approached the Mustang with professional skepticism. He had heard the optimistic projections about range, read the performance reports, studied the technical specifications, but specifications meant nothing until proven in combat. On March 3, 1944, the opportunity arrived. The mission orders called for a maximum effort against Berlin, the Nazi capital, a target that had remained beyond effective escort range throughout the war. Over 700 heavy bombers would attack industrial targets in and around the city. Every available fighter would provide escort, and for the first time, P-51 Mustangs would attempt to accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. The briefing at Debden that morning carried unusual tension. Intelligence officer Major George Carpenter pulled back the curtain covering the mission map. A red ribbon stretched from their base across the North Sea, across Holland, across the length of Germany, terminating at Berlin. The room fell silent. Pilots stared at the map, calculating distances, mentally reviewing fuel consumption figures, contemplating the implications. 600 miles one way, 1,100 miles round trip, through defended airspace, against an enemy that would throw everything available at the formations. Captain Don Gentile, who would become one of the war's top aces, remembered the moment in his memoir. "We all knew what that map meant. If we could actually do this, if we could escort bombers to Berlin, the whole strategic picture would change. The Luftwaffe had been able to wait us out, let our shorter-range escorts turn back, then hit the bombers when they were most vulnerable. If we could stay with them all the way, the Germans would have to fight us to get to the bombers. They could not wait us out anymore." But first, they had to prove it was possible. The mission launched in the pre-dawn darkness of March 4th. Ground crews had worked through the night, mounting the brown paper drop tanks under each Mustang's wings, filling them carefully with high-octane aviation fuel. These tanks, manufactured by Bowater Lloyd in Britain, looked fragile, almost comically inadequate for the mission ahead. They were literally constructed from laminated paper and plastic resin, the same materials used for newspaper production. But tests had proven them effective, and they weighed far less than metal tanks, allowing greater fuel capacity for the same weight penalty. Lieutenant William Overstreet climbed into his P-51B in the cold March morning, running through pre-flight checks by flashlight. 2 drop tanks hung beneath his wings, fat cylinders that seemed almost as large as the fuselage. They added substantial drag, would reduce speed and maneuverability until dropped, but they contained the fuel that might, possibly, allow him to reach Berlin and return home. The mathematics were tight, no margin for error. Any combat that forced high power settings and heavy fuel consumption could leave them swimming in the North Sea if they survived at all. The formations assembled over England as dawn broke, hundreds of bombers climbing slowly to altitude, fighter groups sliding into escort positions. The aerial armada turned east, crossing the English coast, heading toward Germany. Overstreet settled into formation, monitoring his fuel gauges, watching the drop tank indicators. The fuel system was designed to draw from the drop tanks first, preserving internal fuel for the return journey and any combat that awaited. If everything worked perfectly, if fuel consumption matched predictions, if they encountered no unexpected headwinds or navigation errors, they might just make it. The German radar network detected the formations early, tracking the massive raid as it crossed the Dutch coast and penetrated German airspace. At Luftwaffe bases across northern Germany, fighter units scrambled to intercept. But something was different about this mission. The American escorts were not turning back. The P-47 Thunderbolts that usually provided escort to the German border continued deeper into Reich territory than ever before. And mixed among them were strange new fighters, sleeker, faster-looking, continuing past the point where escorts always turned back.
Oberleutnant Heinz Knocke, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, spotted the American formations approaching from the west at 28,000 feet. His Bf-109G climbed to intercept altitude, the Daimler-Benz engine straining in the thin, cold air. But before he could position for an attack on the bombers, American fighters appeared, engaging his swarm before they could reach the heavies. These were not Thunderbolts. They were smaller, faster, more maneuverable. And they were still hundreds of miles inside Germany, far beyond where any escort should possess fuel to remain. Knocke broke hard left as tracer rounds flashed past his canopy. The American fighter followed through the turn, staying with him, still fast, still dangerous. He dove, accelerating toward the deck, and the enemy fighter stayed on his tail. Only by diving through cloud cover and hedge-hopping at extreme low altitude did Knocke escape. He returned to his base shaken, his Bf-109 bullet-scarred, his confidence in German intelligence badly undermined. In the debriefing, he reported Mustangs over central Germany, still escorting bombers, still combat-capable, hundreds of miles from their English bases. His intelligence officer was skeptical. The reports must be mistaken. American fighters could not reach this far into Germany. The range numbers did not support it. But Knocke insisted. He had seen them. He had fought them. They were there, deep inside Germany, protecting the bombers, engaging German fighters with complete tactical flexibility. And then the reports started arriving from Berlin itself. Fighter pilots defending the capital reported American single-engine fighters over the city, escorts accompanying the bomber formations, fighting at altitude, waggling wings as they passed over the burning targets. Impossible, but happening. Verified by multiple witnesses, confirmed by flak batteries whose optical rangefinders tracked the strange, sleek fighters through Berlin's smoke-filled sky. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was immediate and profound. For years, German fighter pilots had operated with one fundamental certainty. Deep inside Germany, they owned the sky. Bombers would come, but they would come alone, unescorted, vulnerable. German fighters could position for optimal attacks, could make multiple passes, could break off when damaged and return for another attempt. The escorts would be gone, back in England, tied to their bases by the unbreakable chain of fuel limitations. On March 4, 1944, that certainty evaporated. American fighters had reached Berlin. The impossible had become operational reality. And if Americans could escort to Berlin, they could escort anywhere in Germany. There was nowhere left to wait in safety, no invisible line beyond which the Luftwaffe could operate without facing enemy fighters. The entire strategic equation of the bomber war had shifted in a single mission. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, received the reports with growing alarm. If confirmed, this changed everything. The defensive strategy that had inflicted terrible losses on unescorted bomber formations would no longer work. German fighters would now have to fight through escort screens to reach the bombers, and the Americans would choose when and where to fight, using their superior numbers and now apparently superior range to overwhelm German defenses through sheer mass. At Debden, the returning Mustang pilots were jubilant, exhausted, and somewhat amazed. They had done it. They had flown to Berlin, had engaged German fighters over the Nazi capital, and had made it home with fuel remaining in their tanks. William Overstreet shut down his Merlin engine after landing, climbed out of his cockpit, and stared at his Mustang. The empty drop tanks had been jettisoned over Germany. Fuel gauges showed approximately 45 gallons remaining in the internal tanks. 45 gallons. Perhaps 30 minutes of flight time at cruise settings. The margins had been razor thin, but they had proven it possible. Don Blakeslee's combat report was characteristically direct. Mission accomplished. Escorted bombers to Berlin, engaged enemy fighters over target area. All assigned escort tasks completed. The P-51 can make it to Berlin with fuel reserve for combat. Those dry, professional words marked a turning point in the air war over Europe, though few yet understood the full implications. The Luftwaffe would learn those implications through bitter experience over the coming months. But in the immediate aftermath of March 4, 1944, German intelligence struggled to process what had happened. Some senior officers refused to believe the reports, insisting that the aircraft over Berlin must have been twin-engine types misidentified by observers. Others proposed that the Americans had established secret forward bases inside occupied territory, an explanation that reconnaissance quickly disproved. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. American engineers had solved the range problem. They had created a fighter with performance, armament, and handling that matched or exceeded the best German types, combined with range that doubled what German designers thought possible in a single-engine machine. The technical achievement was remarkable. The strategic implications were devastating. The interrogation rooms at Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters in Berlin became scenes of increasingly desperate attempts to understand what had happened. German fighter pilots captured by advancing Allied forces or shot down over friendly territory and recovered, provided fragmentary accounts of encounters with Mustangs at extreme ranges. The reports were consistent, troubling, and impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or confusion. Hauptmann Gustav Rodel, a veteran with 98 confirmed victories from the Eastern and Western fronts, flew his first mission against Mustang-escorted bombers on March 6th, the second major raid on Berlin. His after-action report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, described the tactical dilemma German pilots now faced with clinical precision. We positioned above the bomber stream at 32,000 feet, preparing to dive through the escort screen for a single firing pass at the heavy bombers. But the American fighters climbed to meet us. They had altitude, they had speed, and they showed no indication of fuel concerns that would force conservation of power settings. We engaged for approximately 12 minutes. I damaged one Mustang but could not confirm destruction. We broke off the engagement due to fuel limitations. The Americans did not break off. They continued escorting the bombers still over 400 kilometers inside Reich territory. The fundamental asymmetry was now painfully clear. German fighters had to manage fuel carefully, always calculating range back to their bases, always conscious of the dwindling reserves in their tanks. American escorts could afford to fight aggressively, to pursue fleeing German fighters, to maintain high power settings throughout combat, because they carried fuel reserves that German pilots found almost incomprehensible. The psychological weight of this disparity proved nearly as important as the tactical reality. Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's most capable and experienced pilots, attempted to explain the changed situation to younger, less experienced pilots at a training briefing in mid-March. His words, recorded by a staff officer, captured the bitter recognition that was spreading through the Jagdwaffe.
When we engaged the British over England in 1940, we were the ones with limited fuel. We had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes over the target before we had to turn for home. The British defenders could fight until their ammunition ran out, then land, rearm, and return. We understood what that disadvantage felt like. Now the situation has reversed, but far worse. The Americans can escort deep into Germany, can engage us over our own territory, and still have fuel to hunt us back to our airfields. They own our sky now. We are the ones fighting on borrowed time, always watching our fuel gauges, always calculating if we have enough to make it home. The Technical Intelligence Branch of the Luftwaffe, the Technische Amt, launched intensive efforts to understand how the Americans had achieved this seemingly impossible range. Captured P-51s were studied meticulously at Rechlin and other testing facilities. German engineers measured fuel tank capacities, calculated consumption rates, analyzed the aerodynamic efficiency of the laminar-flow wing design. The numbers confirmed what combat experience had already demonstrated. The Mustang represented a brilliant integration of multiple engineering advances that together produced revolutionary capability. The laminar flow wing, designed by North Americans' team using NACA research, was more aerodynamically efficient than conventional airfoil sections, reducing drag by approximately 20% compared to wings on the BF-109 or FW-190. Less drag meant less fuel consumed to maintain a given speed. The Packard Merlin engine, while powerful, was also remarkably fuel-efficient at cruise settings, sipping fuel at economical rates when not pushed to combat power. The internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons exceeded German single-engine fighters by more than double, and the addition of two 108-gallon drop tanks brought total fuel load to 400 gallons. German engineers ran the calculations repeatedly, hoping to find an error, some overlooked factor that would explain the numbers as less threatening than they appeared. But the mathematics were unforgiving. With careful throttle management, the P-51B could achieve approximately 6 hours of flight time. 6 hours, enough to fly from England to Berlin and back with reserves for combat, for navigation errors, for headwinds, for all the unpredictable variables of operational flying. The BF-109G, by comparison, could barely manage 90 minutes of total flight time on internal fuel. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, received a technical briefing on Mustang capabilities in late March. His reaction, recorded in his post-war memoir, reflected the spreading demoralization among Luftwaffe commanders who understood strategy. When the intelligence officer finished his presentation, showing us the fuel consumption curves and range calculations, we all sat in silence. Someone finally asked if there was any way we could achieve similar range in our fighters. The answer was no. Not without a complete redesign from the ground up, not without access to materials we no longer had in sufficient quantities, not without manufacturing capacity we could not spare from aircraft production. We were told to develop tactics to counter the American range advantage, but there are no tactics that overcome being outnumbered 10-to-1 by fighters that can fly twice as far as your own.
The Luftwaffe attempted several adaptations to the new reality. Fighter units practiced fuel-efficient cruise techniques, leaning mixture settings to extend range as much as possible. Ground controllers directed interceptors more efficiently, reducing wasted flight time searching for bomber formations. Some units experimented with pairs of fighters, one carrying external drop tanks to extend range, the other flying clean for better combat performance. But these measures provided marginal improvements that could not bridge the fundamental gap. More ambitious responses involved aircraft development programs. The Focke-Wulf TA-152, a high-altitude development of the FW-190 with extended wings and pressurized cockpit, promised excellent performance above 30,000 feet, where much of the combat occurred. The Messerschmitt Bf-109K,
incorporated numerous improvements and refinements over earlier Gustav models. Jet fighters like the Me-262 offered revolutionary speed that could potentially allow German pilots to strike and escape before American escorts could react. But these programs required time, resources, and stable production facilities, all of which were increasingly scarce in the deteriorating strategic situation of 1944. Meanwhile, American Mustang operations expanded and intensified. The March 4th mission to Berlin was followed by March 6th, March 8th, March 9th. Mustangs ranged across Germany, escorting bombers to targets that had previously seemed immune from daylight attack. Munich, 600 miles from England. Vienna, 800 miles. The 8th Air Force, emboldened by effective escort, planned missions with greater aggression, striking deeper, hitting more targets, maintaining relentless pressure that German industry could not withstand. The human cost of this air campaign was measured in different ways by each side. For the Luftwaffe, veteran pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience were killed or wounded at rates that pilot training programs could not replace. Germany had begun the war with a substantial cadre of experienced, superbly trained fighter pilots. By mid-1944, that irreplaceable asset was being consumed in the grinding attrition of daily combat against numerically superior opponents in increasingly obsolescent aircraft. Oberlieutenant Emil Lang, credited with 173 victories, primarily on the Eastern Front, transferred to the West in early 1944. He described the difference in a letter to a friend recovered after the war. In Russia, we fought Soviet fighters that were often inferior to our machines, flown by pilots with minimal training. We achieved multiple victories per mission. Here in the West, we fight Americans in aircraft as good as ours or better, flown by pilots who have been thoroughly trained and who possess unlimited fuel and ammunition. I have flown 14 missions in 3 weeks. I have claimed 4 victories. I have been forced to break off combat due to fuel exhaustion 11 times. 3 of my Staffel's pilots have been killed, 2 more wounded. The mathematics are not sustainable. Lang was shot down and killed on September 3, 1944, during a mission against American bombers. His death, like thousands of others, represented not just the loss of a skilled pilot, but the erosion of institutional knowledge and combat experience that could not be regenerated in the time remaining to Germany. For American bomber crews, the presence of long-range escorts meant the difference between missions of desperate vulnerability and operations where survival odds improved dramatically. Staff Sergeant Robert Morgan, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 of the 300th Bomb Group, flew missions both before and after effective long-range escort became standard. His testimony to military historians after the war provided the bomber crew perspective on what the Mustang meant operationally. Before the Mustangs could escort us all the way, every deep mission felt like a suicide run. We would watch our escorts turn back somewhere over Germany, and then we knew we were alone. The German fighters would appear, dozens of them, and they would work us over for hours. We would lose 5, 6, 8 aircraft from the formation. You would see fortresses falling out of the sky, spinning down, trailing smoke and fire, and you would think that could be us on the next pass. After the Mustangs started escorting us all the way, everything changed. The Germans still came after us, but they had to fight through the escorts first. We could see the dogfights happening above us and around us, Mustangs chasing Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs away from the formation. Sometimes a German fighter would get through and make a pass at us, but it was isolated, not the sustained, coordinated attacks we used to face. Our loss rates dropped dramatically,
from 8 or 10% per mission to 2 or 3%. That difference is the difference between an unsustainable campaign and one we could win. The statistical evidence supported these personal accounts with stark clarity. During the missions to Schweinfurt in August and October 1943, before effective long-range escort, bomber losses exceeded 20% on individual missions. Monthly loss rates for heavy bomb groups ran between 6 and 8%, an unsustainable rate that would destroy entire groups within 15 to 20 missions. After Mustang escorts became standard in March 1944, monthly loss rates dropped to between 1.5% and 2.5%. Individual missions rarely exceeded 5% losses, except under exceptional circumstances. These numbers translated directly into human lives. Approximately 8,000 American bomber crewmen avoided death or capture because of reduced loss rates attributable to long-range fighter escort. 8,000 men who completed their tours and went home instead of dying and burning aircraft over Germany or spending years in prisoner-of-war camps. The strategic importance of the Mustang's range capability could be measured in these saved lives as directly as in any analysis of industrial targets destroyed or German fighter strength retreated. The Luftwaffe's intelligence services attempted to determine if American range capabilities could be further extended. Captured Mustang pilots were interrogated carefully about fuel management techniques, cruise control procedures, and any classified modifications or special equipment. The Germans discovered that American pilots used relatively straightforward fuel management procedures, nothing exotic or particularly secret. They flew at economical cruise settings during non-combat portions of missions, typically around 250 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, where the Merlin engine sipped fuel efficiently. They used the drop tanks first, preserving internal fuel. They avoided unnecessary high-power settings that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. But most importantly, American pilots had been trained to trust their fuel reserves. They had flown multiple training missions at extended ranges during their stateside preparation, had internalized the fuel consumption rates and range capabilities of their aircraft. They did not fly in constant fear of running out of fuel because their aircraft genuinely possessed the range to complete the missions assigned. This psychological confidence translated into tactical flexibility and aggressive combat engagement that German pilots, always fuel-conscious, could not match. The Luftwaffe's intelligence services attempted to determine if American range capabilities could be further extended. Captured Mustang pilots were interrogated carefully about fuel management techniques, cruise control procedures, and any classified modifications or special equipment. The Germans discovered that American pilots used relatively straightforward fuel management procedures, nothing exotic or particularly secret. They flew at economical cruise settings during non-combat portions of missions, typically around 250 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, where the Merlin engine sipped fuel efficiently. They used the drop tanks first, preserving internal fuel. They avoided unnecessary high-power settings that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. But most importantly, American pilots had been trained to trust their fuel reserves. They had flown multiple training missions at extended ranges during their stateside preparation, had internalized the fuel consumption rates and range capabilities of their aircraft. They did not fly in constant fear of running out of fuel because their aircraft genuinely possessed the range to complete the missions assigned. This psychological confidence translated into tactical flexibility and aggressive combat engagement that German pilots, always fuel-conscious, could not match. The Luftwaffe's leadership recognized that the Mustang's appearance over Berlin represented more than just a tactical development. It signaled the complete failure of Germany's strategic assumptions about American capabilities and the air war's trajectory. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, reacted with characteristic volatility to reports of American fighters over Berlin. While the specific quote often attributed to him, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," cannot be verified in primary sources, documented testimony from multiple sources confirms he recognized the strategic implications immediately. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, in his post-war interrogation by Allied intelligence officers, stated that Goering had raged at his staff about intelligence failures, demanding to know why no one had warned him that American fighters could reach Berlin. Galland's response, according to his testimony, was blunt. "Herr Reich Marshal, we told you repeatedly that the Americans were developing long-range fighters. We warned that their industrial capacity and engineering capabilities should not be underestimated. These warnings were dismissed as defeatist thinking." The political leadership of Nazi Germany refused to acknowledge publicly that American fighters now ranged freely across German airspace. Propaganda outlets continued claiming that the Luftwaffe maintained control of Reich airspace, that German fighters destroyed American bombers in large numbers, that victory remained achievable through superior will and new wonder weapons under development. But German civilians could see contrails crisscrossing the sky at high altitude, could watch dogfights occurring over their cities, could observe American fighters strafing targets at low level with apparent impunity. The gap between propaganda and observable reality contributed to eroding civilian morale in ways that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels recognized but could not effectively counter.
For German fighter pilots, the appearance of Mustangs at extreme ranges meant accepting a new operational reality that offered no good options. If they engaged the escorts, they consumed fuel and ammunition fighting an enemy that possessed numerical superiority and tactical flexibility. If they avoided the escorts and tried to reach the bombers, they faced massed defensive fire from the bomber formations and the risk of escorts diving down to engage them from advantageous positions. If they refused to engage at all, the bombers struck their targets unopposed, and the pilots faced accusations of cowardice or defeatism from political leadership that did not understand the tactical impossibilities they confronted. Oberleutnant Heinz Knok, whose diary provides one of the most detailed personal accounts of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot's experience, wrote on March 22, 1944, about the psychological burden of flying against increasingly hopeless odds. Today, we scrambled against a formation of over 600 bombers, escorted by what seemed like an equal number of fighters. Our Group A put up 21 aircraft, 21 against 600. We made one pass at the bomber stream, claimed 2 fortresses damaged, lost 3 of our own aircraft, and landed with fuel indicators reading nearly empty. This is not combat. This is a slow form of execution. We continue flying because orders demand it, and because to refuse would mean facing firing squad. But no one believes we can win. We fly to delay defeat, nothing more. The strategic air campaign over Germany had fundamentally changed character by spring of 1944. What had been a desperate, bloody struggle with uncertain outcome had become a systematic destruction of German war-making capacity. American and British bombers, now protected by long-range escorts throughout their missions, struck German industries with mounting effectiveness. Oil production facilities, essential for military operations, were hit repeatedly. Aircraft factories, despite dispersion and camouflage efforts, suffered steady attrition. Transportation networks, the railways and canals that moved materials and finished goods, were torn apart by bombing and fighter-bomber attacks. The Luftwaffe itself became a target. American escorts did not merely defend bombers, they actively hunted German fighters, following them to their airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, destroying the infrastructure that supported operations. Major James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group described this shift in tactical approach. In the early days, our mission was purely defensive. Protect the bombers, stay with the heavies, don't go chasing after German fighters. But by spring of 1944, with our extended range, we could afford to be more aggressive. If a German formation tried to set up an attack on the bombers, we would engage them and drive them away. If German fighters retreated to their airfields, we would follow them down and strafe the airfield. We were not just defending anymore, we were actively destroying the Luftwaffe wherever we found it. This aggressive employment of long-range fighters accelerated the Luftwaffe's collapse. German fighter strength, measured in operational aircraft available for missions, declined steadily despite continuing production. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground, damaged beyond economical repair, or lost in combat at rates exceeding replacements. Pilot losses mounted even faster. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Their tactical knowledge, combatant skills, and ability to survive represented assets that required years to develop and could be lost in seconds. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had been so weakened by attrition that it could provide minimal interference with the invasion. German fighters that had dominated European skies in 1940 through 42 were now scarce, ineffective, and largely irrelevant to operational outcomes. The long-range escort capability provided by Mustangs, combined with overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and industrial capacity, had achieved air supremacy over Western Europe. The Mustang's technical specifications told part of the story. maximum speed of 441 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, service ceiling of 41,900 feet, rate of climb of 3,200 feet per minute at sea level, armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns with approximately 400 rounds per gun, range with drop tanks of approximately 2,000 miles, though operational combat radius was conservatively calculated at 850 miles to provide reserves for combat and contingencies. But specifications could not capture what the Mustang meant operationally. It meant American bombers could strike any target in Germany with fighter escort. It meant German fighters could not wait in safety for escorts to turn back. It meant the Luftwaffe had to engage under circumstances that favored American numerical superiority and tactical flexibility. It meant, ultimately, that Germany could not defend its airspace against determined Allied attack. The strategic consequences flowed directly from this operational reality. The human dimension of this story extended beyond pilots and aircrew to the thousands of workers who built Mustangs, the engineers who solved technical problems, the logistics personnel who delivered fuel and ammunition and spare parts to forward bases. North American Aviation's factory in Inglewood, California, produced Mustangs on assembly lines that incorporated lessons learned from automobile manufacturing. Workers, many of them women who had entered industrial work because of wartime labor shortages, built these aircraft with remarkable quality and consistency. Production rates climbed steadily through 1944. By peak production in 1945, North American was delivering over 800 Mustangs per month from the Inglewood plant alone, with additional production at a plant in Dallas, Texas. This industrial capacity, the ability to produce thousands of high-quality fighter aircraft while simultaneously building bombers, transports, trainers, and all the other weapons and equipment modern warfare required, demonstrated American industrial strength in ways that affected German strategic calculations as much as any battlefield outcome. German leaders understood, intellectually at least, that they faced an opponent with vastly greater industrial capacity. But seeing that capacity manifested in formations of hundreds of bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters, all replaceable, all supported by seemingly unlimited fuel and ammunition and spare parts, drove the point home with undeniable force. Germany could not win a war of industrial attrition against the combined resources of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The appearance of long-range American fighters deep inside Germany made that mathematical reality operationally explicit. The Mustang story also highlighted the importance of incremental technical innovation. No single revolutionary breakthrough made the P-51's range possible. Rather, it resulted from multiple modest improvements that together produced revolutionary capability. The laminar-flow wing reduced drag by perhaps 20%, not a dramatic figure, but significant when compounded over long distances. The Packard Merlin engine provided excellent power-to-weight ratio and fuel efficiency, better than contemporary American radial engines, but not miraculously so. The paper drop tanks added fuel capacity without excessive weight penalty, but the concept of drop tanks was not new. What made the Mustang exceptional was the integration of these elements into a coherent design optimized for specific mission requirements. North American's engineers understood that escort required specific characteristics, range above all, but also high-altitude performance, speed sufficient to catch enemy interceptors, and enough armament to effectively engage enemy fighters. They designed an aircraft that delivered those characteristics, accepting trade-offs in other areas that mattered less for the escort mission. The result was an aircraft that did not excel at every possible fighter mission, but was superbly optimized for the mission that mattered most strategically in 1944. German aircraft design, by contrast, often pursued performance maxima without clear prioritization of mission requirements. The Bf-109 evolved through successive variants that added more power, heavier armament, better protection, transforming an elegant light fighter into a heavier, more complex machine that retained excellent performance but lost the simplicity and ease of handling that had made early versions so effective.
The FW-190, a superb aircraft in many respects, suffered from limited high-altitude performance because its BMW radial engine could not match the power-to-weight ratio of inline engines at altitude. German designers recognized these limitations but lacked the resources and time to fully address them before the war's outcome was decided. The final months of World War II in Europe saw Mustangs ranging across Germany essentially unopposed. The Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, but in diminishing numbers with decreasing effectiveness. By March 1945, German fuel stocks had been reduced to critical levels by Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants. Many German aircraft sat idle on airfields, unable to fly for lack of fuel. Pilot training had been reduced to minimal levels. New pilots arrived at operational units with perhaps 30 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, certainly insufficient for combat survival.
Against this collapsing opposition, American Mustangs conducted fighter sweeps across Germany, strafing anything that moved, attacking rail yards and supply convoys, providing close air support for advancing Allied ground forces. The transformation from a defensive escort fighter to an offensive weapon of opportunity demonstrated the aircraft's versatility and the operational flexibility that air supremacy provided. The Mustang's operational record speaks through the statistics that represent human experiences and historical outcomes. P-51s destroyed approximately 4,750 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat during World War II, more than any other American fighter type. They shot down additional aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks. P-51 units achieved favorable kill ratios against all German fighter types, including the advanced jets that appeared in the war's final months. The Mustang proved capable of engaging even the Ma-262 jet successfully, using superior numbers and tactical positioning to offset the jet's speed advantage. But perhaps more significantly, Mustangs made the strategic bombing campaign viable by reducing bomber losses to sustainable levels. Without effective long-range escort, the daylight bombing campaign would have faced serious questions about its sustainability and effectiveness. Losses of 5, 8, 10% per mission could not be sustained indefinitely. Bomber groups would have been destroyed through attrition faster than they could be replaced and refilled with trained crews. The Mustang's range capability solved this fundamental problem, allowing the bombing campaign to continue and intensify until Germany's industrial capacity was effectively destroyed. The German pilots who initially laughed at claims of American fighters reaching Berlin learned through bitter experience that American engineering and industrial capabilities exceeded their expectations dramatically. The comfortable assumption that physical laws limited fighter range to predictable maxima proved wrong when American designers found ways to push those limits through aerodynamic efficiency, careful systems integration, and innovative solutions like paper drop tanks. The laugh died in their throats as they watched contrails of Mustangs crisscrossing German skies at altitudes where their own fighters struggled to maintain performance. Heinz Knoke survived the war, one of the relatively few experienced Luftwaffe pilots to do so. His post-war reflections on the Mustang's impact captured the perspective of those who faced the aircraft in combat. "We were told American fighters could not reach Berlin. We believed this because it seemed technically impossible, given what we understood about fighter design. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin in March 1944, we realized our assumptions were wrong. But by then it was too late. The Americans had solved a problem we thought unsolvable, and they did it with what appeared to be a relatively simple, straightforward fighter. No exotic technology, no revolutionary innovations. Just good engineering applied systematically to achieve a specific operational goal. That was perhaps the most demoralizing realization. They had out-engineered us with conventional technology, and we lacked the resources to catch up." The legacy of the P-51 Mustang extended well beyond World War II. The aircraft served with many nations' air forces through the Korean War and beyond. Some Mustangs remained in military service into the 1980s with smaller air forces.
The design influenced post-war fighter development in numerous ways, demonstrating the value of range and operational flexibility in fighter aircraft. The emphasis on escort capability and multi-role flexibility became standard in subsequent fighter designs. But the Mustang's greatest impact may have been proving that strategic air power could work when properly supported. The theory of strategic bombing, the idea that air power could destroy an enemy's industrial capacity and break their will to fight, had been controversial before World War II. Early results seemed to validate skeptics who argued that bombers could not survive against determined fighter defenses. The Mustang, by enabling effective escort throughout the combat zone, allowed the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives and validate the theory that air power could be decisive in modern warfare. The story of Luftwaffe pilots laughing at claims of P-51 range, then confronting the reality of Mustangs over Berlin, illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare and technological competition. Assumptions about physical limits and technical possibilities can be wrong. What seems impossible based on current understanding may become achievable through innovation, determination, and systematic problem-solving. The side that recognizes this reality and acts on it gains advantages that can prove strategically decisive. American engineers in 1943 faced a clear problem. Bomber losses were unsustainable without effective long-range escort. They solved that problem by creating an aircraft optimized specifically for extended-range escort operations. They accepted trade-offs, prioritized requirements, and delivered capability that changed the strategic equation. German engineers faced the same physical laws and technical constraints, but lacked the resources, time, and industrial capacity to respond effectively. By the time the Luftwaffe fully understood what they faced, the outcome had been essentially decided. The final accounting of the air war over Europe showed numbers that told stories of human courage, suffering, and sacrifice on all sides. The United States 8th Air Force alone lost approximately 26,000 men killed in combat operations. The RAF Bomber Command lost 55,000 crew in its night bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of pilots and aircrew defending German airspace against overwhelming odds. German civilians suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths from Allied bombing, a cost that raises ethical questions about strategic bombing's human toll. But within this vast tragedy, the technical story of how American fighters achieved range to escort bombers to Berlin represents a narrative of engineering problem-solving that changed warfare's trajectory. The Mustang did not win the war alone. Victory required the combined efforts of millions of people across all military services and home front industries. But the P-51 solved a critical problem at a crucial time, enabling the strategic air campaign to continue when its viability was in serious doubt. For the Luftwaffe pilots who watched American contrails crisscross German skies through 1944 and 45, the Mustang came to symbolize their impossible situation. Fast enough that they could not run, numerous enough that they could not win through combat, possessed of range that eliminated any sanctuary where German fighters could wait safely. The very characteristics that made the Mustang so effective as an escort fighter made it devastating to the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy and pilot morale. The transformation from skepticism to bitter recognition happened quickly once the first Mustangs appeared over Berlin. Within weeks, German fighter pilots understood their tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Within months, the cumulative effects of that change, multiplied across hundreds of escort missions, had broken the Luftwaffe's ability to effectively contest Allied air operations. By war's end, the sky over Germany belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang had played a central role in achieving that air supremacy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.